Okay, here comes your video review for the final exam. We're just going to go through the study guide question by question and answer the questions if you want to follow along. This is a PowerPoint that is saved under the Announcements tab, Basic Rules and Types of Photography. It's the first section we talked about after coming back from midterms. And so we're just going to go through it one by one. So define photojournalism. It's just telling stories with photographs. The 5 types of stories that you would tell as a photojournalist would be general news, spot news, portraits, sports, and the photo story. Just real quickly, kind of an example of each one. General news is news that's planned, so that's stuff that's scheduled, that's events, that's court dates, that's press conferences. Spot news is your breaking news, so that's news that is not planned, that's things like fires, car crashes, murders. Portraits are stories about a specific person. Sports is pretty obvious. It's a sports story. And then the photo story is an in-depth story that you tell through photographs. And you guys are familiar with photo story. You've had to identify one. And also that's your final assignment, is working on a photo story. So for the test, not only might I ask you what the 5 categories are, but I may give you an example of a story and ask you what kind of story is it? Is it general news? Is it spot news? Is it sports, etc.? Okay, question 3. The 7 shots of a photo story. So let's move ahead to photo stories here. You got your signature shot, your establishing shot, your close-up, portrait, interaction, how-to sequence, and clincher. And be able to identify them. So the signature shot is the best shot of your story that kind of summarizes your story. Your establishing shot is your opening shot, and often that's going to be showing the scene, so it'll often be a wide shot. Close-up's pretty self-explanatory. Portrait's pretty self-explanatory. Interaction, that would be just a photo that shows 2 or more people working together on something. A how-to sequence would be a series of photos that take you through a specific process. And then the clincher is just the last photo of the story. All right, the 7 types of shots you worked on for your first 2 assignments. Okay, so the types of shots you guys got and that you put in a slideshow. You did a portrait, which was a picture of a person. A self-portrait, which is a picture of yourself. A landscape shot, again, that's a wide shot of either nature or buildings, but no people. An action shot is a shot with movement. An architecture shot is a shot of a building. Circus color shot, that's a picture with bright colors, red, yellow, and blue usually. And a macro shot is a close-up shot of something very small. The 2 types of portrait shots we discussed in class. Remember, you have a candid shot or a planned shot. So a planned shot is like someone that knows they're getting their picture taken. And then a candid shot is a picture of a person where they don't know that they're having their picture taken. What's one thing missing from landscape shots? We talked about that. Landscape shots don't have people. When capturing action shots, what are the 2 things you want to capture? You want to capture the object of focus, which in most sports shots is going to be a ball, or like in hockey, it would be the hockey puck. It's what people are fighting over. And then you want to catch emotion. One way to show scale with macro shots. So a way to show scale with the macro shot is put the object against something to compare it. For instance, with a little Star Wars guy here, we could make him look big or small. But if we want people to realize he's small, we would put him on the single key of a keyboard to realize just how small he is. So you show scale by putting your object next to something that everyone kind of already knows the size of. The most interesting body part of people is their faces. And how do we show emotion in photos? Again, we show their faces. So, knowing your focus, what should you check in a photograph? You want to check your background. How do you get a good shot? You get close. Name 3 elements of a photograph. Be able to define them. So we're going to move forward here a little bit to the elements of photography that we talked about. Light. Light is the single most important element because without some sort of light, we cannot see. Composition, that is putting a frame around elements in a photograph. And then moment, that's just knowing the right moment to take the photo. So which element is most important and why? We already told you light is most important because without light you can't see. The 4 rules of composition we discussed in class. So we talked about this a lot with videography, not just photography, but the rules of composition we talked about was rule of thirds, which you guys should be very familiar with right now. Leading lines, repetition of pattern, and depth of field. So one of the things I would probably do for the final is show you a photo and ask you to identify which element it uses. Does it use rule of thirds? Does it use leading lines? Does it use repetition of pattern? Is it a shallow or deep depth of field? Okay. What is the difference between shallow and deep depth of field? So shallow depth of field is when the object of focus is in sharp focus, but the background or foreground is blurry. And deep depth of field means the entire photograph is in focus. Headroom. Okay, so you guys should know what headroom is. Headroom is the space between the top of someone's head and the edge of the photograph. And you want to be able to make sure that there's proper headroom. Nose room is a space in front of and in the direction of moving or stationary subjects. Backlighting. Backlighting is the process of illuminating someone from behind. And I put here, is it good or bad? And the answer to that is it depends. Proper backlighting would just give someone a rosy kind of golden glow around their head. But too much backlighting is going to cause you to have an overexposed picture or deep shadows. Balance. Remember, we talked about balance, and it's capturing images within a frame so that all parts of the image we have equal visual weight. And remember, we talked a little bit about how balance is kind of hard to identify. When we showed you the pictures that we used for balance, a lot of people had a hard time identifying which one it was. In this one, the first picture is the one that's appropriately balanced because all parts of the photograph, both the left and right, have equal visual weight. You don't have a whole lot of empty space like you would in this picture. It has a lot of empty space. And so negative space is that empty space around images in a photograph. Okay, so that wraps up section 1. Now we're going to move on to section 2, which is depth of field, and we also covered some photography terms. So we're going to open that up. Depth of field is the area of space that is in acceptably sharp focus, both in front of and behind the exact point at which the camera lens is focused. And define and identify shallow and deep depth of field. We already did that in section 1. But again, shallow depth of field is when one subject is in sharp focus, but the background or foreground is blurry. And deep depth of field is when everything is in focus. Where's the depth of field scale located on the camera? What I would probably do is give you a diagram and ask you to identify where the depth of field scale is. So it's that scale there in the middle. It's the one that's got feet and meters on it. And it's the scale between your focus ring, which is the bottom ring, and your aperture ring, which is the top ring. Okay. ISO, the level of sensitivity of your camera to available light. The normal preset for an ISO is usually around 100 or 200. And the problem that presents when you raise your ISO is you get noise or grain in your picture. Okay. Shutter speed is the measurement of time in which a camera's shutter is open, allowing light in. Okay, so for various lighting conditions and for action shots. For action shots, you definitely want a fast shutter speed. And for static shots, you could use a slower shutter speed if you wanted. If you have a dark area where you don't have a lot of light, you're going to want a longer shutter speed because the longer that shutter is open, the more light that comes in. If you're in a brightly lit area, you want a quicker shutter speed because you don't need as much light to come in. Most common pitfalls of a slow shutter speed and how to combat it. So a pitfall of a slow shutter speed is that you can get blurriness because the camera starts to shake if the shutter speed's too slow. And the way you can combat it is that you can use a tripod. Aperture, the lens opening through which light enters the camera. So it's basically that little hole I told you that looks like an iris, and it changes sizes depending on what you're doing. So that's what aperture looks like. Know which aperture setting to use in specific lighting conditions or for desired depth of field. So if you look at them, you can kind of tell. You want those low aperture numbers, your f2, your f2.8. You want to use those in dark lighting conditions because the eye will open more and it'll let in more light. If you have a brightly lit area with a lot of light, then you can use a higher aperture like f16 or f22 where it won't let in as much light. When you're talking about aperture and depth of field, use a small aperture if you want a deep depth of field, and if you want shallow depth of field, you can use a larger aperture. Know a few aperture settings and whether they're wide or small. So this kind of helps you. It shows you the different aperture settings. And just remember, the lower numbers, the 2.8s, are actually larger apertures. And then the higher numbers, f16, f22, are actually smaller apertures. So just keep in mind that it's backwards. Hyperfocal distance, that is the distance at which you focus to obtain the maximum depth of field possible. What symbol on your depth of field scale or on your lens do you use for hyperfocal distance? Remember, you use that little infinity symbol. That's the symbol there on that top ring that looks, like a sideways 8. That's your hyperfocal distance symbol. 3 factors that control depth of field. So here we're moving into terminology. And let's see, we can close this and pull up our terminology. Okay, so the 3 factors that affect depth of field are your aperture size, the distance from the subject, so the distance between you and the subject, and the length of your lens. Selective critical focus. So your critical or selective focus is using a limited depth of field to focus sharply on a specific object in a scene. So the object of critical focus would be the thing in your photograph that's in focus when the background and foreground are out of focus. So for example, if I was going to show you a flower and the flower was in sharp focus but the background is blurry, then your object of critical focus would be the flower. What are f-stops? And the f-stops are how we measure aperture. Remember that F refers to the ratio factor, does not refer to focus. Stopping down. Stopping down is the process of decreasing your aperture size. Okay? So if I gave you 2 numbers and asked you to stop down, well, no, okay, let's say I gave you 1 number. I gave you like an F8 and I asked you to stop down 2 f-stops. I want you to know what's going to be next on the list if we stop down 2 f-stops. So if you're decreasing your aperture size from f8, you're going to go up to a bigger number. You're going to go up to f11 or f16. Okay? Opening up is going to a larger aperture opening, but again, a lower f-stop number. So if I say you're on f16 and I want you to open up 3 f-stops, then you're just going to count from 16. You're going to go 11, 8, 5.6. So your next f-stop would be 5.6. A pitfall of using a small aperture to maximize depth of field. So there's all kinds of pitfalls here. So one of the pitfalls of using a small aperture to maximize depth of field is that it's also going to make for a longer shutter speed, which could cause the camera to shake, but you can combat that by using a tripod. What could be a pitfall of using a larger aperture? Well, let's look at the pitfalls of larger apertures. So at larger apertures, too much light can cause overexposure, and a desired background may not be in sharp focus. Because remember, those larger apertures are usually going to give you a more shallow depth of field. Okay, more journalism terms. So let's shut this. And we have a slideshow that was on photojournalism terms, and that's on Canvas too under the announcement tab. So ambient light is the available light completely surrounding a subject. The lighting system most commonly used in studios is 3-point lighting, and it consists of a key light, a fill-in light, and a backlight. The golden ratio is 1 to 1.618, and it is the composition tool found in photography as well in architecture and nature that is most pleasing to the eye. The Fibonacci spiral. So remember, it's a series of squares that use that golden ratio, and then you get the swirl out. So I would want you to be able to identify the Fibonacci spiral symbol, okay? So if I showed you this, I would be like, what is this? What symbol is this? Examples of the Fibonacci spiral in nature include flowers, seashells, the egg. Famous works of art that use the Fibonacci spiral. We have here the birth of Venus. The Mona Lisa is also a very famous photograph that uses the Fibonacci spiral. I don't know if I have it here. Yeah, there it goes. Okay. Identify squares versus spiral in a photo. So if I showed you a photo, I would ask you where the squares are and where the spiral is. So if I show you this photo, you would tell me the squares are around the tree and then the spiral is in the open space to the left of the tree. If I showed you this, you would tell me the squares are on the guy's face and then the spiral is in the open space to the left of the guy's face. The golden rectangle, very similar to the Fibonacci spiral. It's an aspect ratio based on the golden ratio. So you have a rectangle and the sides are 1 and then the other side is 1.618. So the short side, A, is 1 and AB is 1.618. Okay. The phi grid versus the rule of thirds grid. So the phi grid, you guys, or the rule of thirds grid, you guys know what that is, but the phi grid is a little bit shorter. And the phi grid differs from the rule of third grid in that instead of squares, it's rectangles, and the rectangles are based on the golden ratio formula of 1 to 1.618. So basically, if I showed you the two, I might ask you, what do the blue lines represent and what do the black lines represent? Remember, with the phi grid, that center square is going to be kind of short and shrunk down. Okay, bracketing. That's taking photos through a range of exposures. Dodging is lightening areas of photograph, and burning is darkening areas of photograph. All right, so we have gone through quite a bit already. We're more than halfway there. So now we're going to talk about image control, which again, this is on your canvas. So your most common image controls are brightness, contrast, saturation, vibrance, and sharpness. So to define each one, brightness is when you brighten the entire image. Contrast is the scale of difference between black and white. Saturation is the intensity of color in an image. Vibrance is kind of that made-up term, but it's where you adjust the saturation so that clipping is minimized as colors approach full saturation. So vibrance is kind of like smart saturation. It's increasing the intensity of only certain colors in a photograph. And then sharpness is the clear or distinct reproduction of detail. Okay, so going back to saturation, question number 2. As you increase saturation, what becomes more pure? As you increase saturation, colors become more pure. And what type of photos have no saturation? Well, since saturation has to do with color, the type of photos that have no saturation are black or white photos. Black and white photos have awesome contrast, but they do not have saturation. Vibrance prevents what from becoming oversaturated? Vibrance generally prevents skin tones from becoming oversaturated, so people don't look super pink or super red in their photos. What 4 factors discussed in class can affect sharpness? So we're going to go ahead to sharpness here. It can be affected by aperture, shutter speed, ISO, and your lens, which it really, that question kind of goes back to when we were talking about shallow and deep depth of field. And we told you a lot of these things can affect depth of field as well, which depth of field is directly related to sharpness, because in a deep depth of field picture, everything's sharp, but in a shallow depth of field picture, only one object is sharp while the rest is blurry. Does a smaller or larger aperture make a photo appear sharper? So a smaller aperture is going to increase the depth of field, which, yes, will make your object sharper. A camera's sweet spot is usually 2 to 3 stops from your maximum aperture. So if your maximum aperture is 32, to find out the sweet spot, you would go 2 or 3 steps away from that number. A faster or slower shutter speed gives you a sharper shot. A faster shutter speed is going to give you a sharper shot because it's going to not make the camera shake. Which gives you a sharper photo, a high ISO or a low ISO. A higher ISO is going to start to give you that grain and noise, but also a higher ISO allows you to use a faster shutter speed. So I would say a lower ISO is going to give you a sharper image. Another term for brightness, going back to brightness now, it's also called brilliance. Adding contrast to a photo usually makes the colors do what? It makes the colors pop. And at what f-stop do you have to worry about diffraction? So we're going back to sharpness now to find that answer. And diffraction usually happens around f22 or higher on your camera. And what tool do you need to use to have image stabilization? And it's always the same answer, it's a tripod. All right. So now we are going to go on to photo editors, also found on Canvas. This is a short section. Okay, so how long do you have to capture someone's attention with a photo? Less than 3/4 of a second. Values of great photos. Some of the values to look for: news value, the notoriety or celebrity of a subject, how famous they are, action, eye-stopping appeal, which can be further broken down into patterns, contrast, and unique cropping, and then topics. What kind of photos do people like? People like photos of animals and children. What kind of stories do people like? People like feature stories. Know the hierarchy of pictures. So the hierarchy of pictures is you have your lowest level, which is informational. It's just an informational picture. Then you have a picture that's graphically appealing. So it's a picture that's pretty artistically. Then you have emotional. And then your highest tier is intimate. So what I would do with this is, again, give you a series of photos and ask you, is it informational, graphically appealing, intimate, or emotional? Graphically appealing will be pretty obvious. Informational would also be pretty obvious. The ones that kind of get tough to differentiate between are emotional and intimate. And then be able to label photos according to the hierarchy of pictures. Yeah, so we did that. So that's all there is to that section. Now we're on to the last section, which is writing captions. So another term for a caption is a cut line. The loop is a process where first the person looks at the photograph, then reads the caption, then looks back at the photograph. The required information for a caption is who, what, why, when, where, and how. In what tense should captions be written? With captions, the present tense should always be used for the first sentence. After the first sentence, so if you have a 2-sentence caption, The second sentence can be in past tense, but the first sentence always needs to be in present tense. How long should captions be? Captions got to be pretty short. I would say 2 sentences at the most. When is it okay to start a caption with a person's name? So it's okay to start a caption with a person's name when the person is very well known. Passive versus active voice. So remember, you want to use active voice in captions. So if you have a caption where someone's being arrested, your caption could be, police arrest the burglar who broke into the governor's mansion. It would not be, the burglar that broke into the governor's mansion is arrested by police. You can identify passive voice by that word by. If something is done by someone, that's passive voice. So you want to use active voice. The dog bites the boy is active voice. The boy is bitten by the dog is passive voice. Okay. Provide a better verb for a caption. So remember, use powerful verbs. So a tornado doesn't just, arrive or land in a city. A tornado touches down, or a tornado tears through a city. Instead of someone being, instead of someone stumbling, they fall or they plummet. Instead of someone being pulled from the water, they're rescued from the water. So just be able to replace one weak verb with a more powerful verb. When it comes to sports, how should you identify a player? So again, there's very specific rules in sports, which we're going to move forward to now. So you identify players by their name and their jersey number. You include the position of a player if relevant. So when is the position relevant? Well, it depends. In baseball, the catcher and the pitcher is relevant. In football, the quarterback would be relevant. That's really the only instances in which the position is really relevant. What other information should you give in a sports caption? You want to give the result of the play or the game and the date and location of the game. And then being able to identify some common problems in captions. That would be, remember when we went through this and looked at all these different photos and looked at the captions that go with them? So some common weaknesses of captions would be if they start with and or the, if it states the obvious, like people are gathered around the accident site. Well, we can see people are gathered around the accident site. That doesn't give us any new information. So don't state the obvious. If a weak verb, or if you restate the region twice, like in this picture, where it was Qayyarah in the Qayyarah region of Iraq. We don't need the location twice. So weak verbs. Starting with names when the people aren't famous, or giving names when they're not necessary. Remember, this is taking place at a festival where 70,000 people are going to be. We don't care who those 2 people are. Generally, you don't need to use names and captions, again, unless the person is famous, or if you're writing in like a small town newspaper, and it would be possible that the people could be identified. Shorten some things into the crowd. You could just say that people throw tomatoes. You don't need to say into the crowd. Another problem with captions is if they are too long or wordy, or if they give you unnecessary detail. All right. That does it. So in about 30 minutes, we went through the study guide. I know you guys probably might be writing down answers here on the study guide. So if you need to pause this video and then restart it, feel free to do so. But I think that this will be a pretty easy final exam for you. And again, you're going to be taking it at home. So you do have the option of using the things that I've put on the announcements tab of Canvas. You do have the option of using the PowerPoints and the vocabulary worksheet when you do the final exam. So that shouldn't be too hard for you. And then remember, extra credit questions. I will always include some extra credit questions on the exam, and they will be about current events. So I'm going to post the exam to Canvas on Monday. I will post it in the announcements tab and also the assignments tab. And then I will also email you the final exam. A few ways you can turn it in. If you're like me, I like to print stuff off and actually like physically write. So if you wanted to do that, you could, and then you can scan it and send it back to me, or you could take a photograph of it and send me the photographs. If you want to answer it in a text box on Canvas, because it will be, you know, on Canvas, I will make text boxes available for you so that you can write your answers there. If it's a multiple choice thing, you can just mark your answer. You can either write A or B or C or D, or you can highlight the correct answer, or you can just type it out. So it's up to you how you want to turn it in. So you can either email me or you can turn it in on Canvas. But either way, I'm going to need your final exam by Friday, because then I have to turn around and grade it and get your grades turned in by Monday. The extra credit questions on the final exam will be about news stories. They'll be about current events, and it'll be news stories that happened over the weekend, since I'll be adding those on to the exam on Monday and then posting it Monday by midday at the latest. So if you have any questions, go ahead and feel free to email me or send me a text or give me a call, and I'll try to help you out. Good job, guys. We had a great semester, and I hope you have a very Merry Christmas and a good New Year, and stay safe out there. Bye-bye.